From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, a podcast as part of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. And joining me this week is Ohio Congressman and Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan. Chairman Jordan, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
How do you think the convention's going? How does it compare to conventions past? Where do you think the Republican Party stands right now?
I think it's going great. I mean, I guess I say great to all that. Yesterday was an amazing day, and it was, I think, even more amazing in light of what happened over the weekend.
Yeah.
You know, the loss of life, Mr. Compatori, what happened there Saturday, the fact that the good Lord was looking out for President Trump, no doubt about it, because he turns at the exact appropriate second to avoid the bullet. Yeah, totally remarkable. And then his response, which was such an American response in my mind. It's like it showed the strength of his character, the toughness, the defiant, the fist pump was just amazing. And again, I think that's an American reaction in so many ways. That's kind of the American spirit on display in this leader, in this guy of amazing character. So that's the backdrop. And then you have the selection of this young 40-year-old who's going to be, I think, the next vice president, who lived the American dream, the American story, and then President Trump walking out at 10 o'clock last night to a packed arena.
From your home state, too, by the way.
From Ohio.
Native son.
Yeah, he sure is. And you know, the old adage, I've been saying this today, but it makes sense to me. It's like the old line is, it never hurts to have smart people in charge. And,
always a bonus.
Yeah. And President Trump, you've spent time around him. I've gotten to know him over the last 8 years. One smart guy, one good guy. And JD is just a sharp individual. Watch him on Meet the Press a week ago, Sunday. And the way he handled himself was just amazing.
Articulate. Yeah.
Very good.
Well, let's talk about the weekend.
He's as good at handling himself in those interviews as you are writing. Because you do write well. You lay it out logically. It's one of the things I liked about the way you put the argument together.
Well, you actually give me good things to write about. So let's actually talk about that on this weekend assassination attempt. Now, Oversight, Jim Comer. Oversight is your deal. This is what you do. The Oversight Committee itself is, I believe, handling the Secret Service side of this. But Judiciary, which you run, is going to be interacting with the FBI, correct? So have you been briefed on this yet? Do you know if they're making any headway? How do you think the state of that investigation is going?
We got a short briefing yesterday. Ranking Member Nadler, myself, and some of our staff on the committee, and they are investigating. They're kind of the lead agency in doing the investigation. They've done a number of interviews thus far. I tried to express to them, I think in maybe the right way, that there's a concern that I think a lot of Americans have, a skepticism, I would say, that Americans have, that some of the things that have happened in the past and how that might impact their investigation from the Americans' point of view. You know, I didn't say all this to them, but you think about this FBI. This is the FBI that spied on President Trump's campaign. This is the FBI that raided his home. This is the FBI that can't tell us who planted the pipe bombs on January 6th. This is the government that can't tell us who leaked the Dobbs opinion. This is the government that can't tell us who put cocaine at the White House. But now they're going to do this investigation in the run-up to the most important election we have. And okay, but I think that's why there's oversight. That's why the founders in their wisdom had separate and equal branches of government, and there's oversight.
So you have imparted to them that this is an important moment for them to prove themselves.
I think they know
to do a
that
good job and to sort of redeem themselves a bit with some credibility.
Yeah, I don't know how you couldn't know that.
When do you expect? When should we see some answers? Because there's an urgency here, right?
I agree.
We need to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, there's a definite urgency here. We've got Director Wray scheduled. He was already scheduled to come in on next Wednesday, the 24th. And then, of course, Chairman Comer has Director Cheadle coming in next week as well. And then Chairman Green at the Homeland Security Committee is just looking at the concerns. And here's a fundamental question. So I'm no expert in all this, but I think it's sort of common sense, and all the experts we've heard talk. There's a finite number of buildings where a bad guy could get on top of and do what was done on Saturday. And what's that number in that area where the event took place? It's probably a pretty small number. And we know one of those buildings where bad things could happen had the good guys on the building because they took out the bad guy from their elevated position on one of the buildings. So is it 3 buildings, 2 buildings, 5 buildings? Whatever it is, it's a pretty small number. And the idea that they weren't secured, that's a problem. That's the fundamental problem, it seems to me.
This was not downtown New York. This was not Philadelphia. There were not hundreds of buildings around, and also so close as well, too.
It was a farm forum kind of building
it's crazy.
Property area.
You mentioned the FBI. You've also had a very keen eye on the Department of Justice and its prosecutions of Donald Trump from your post at Judiciary. Yesterday, big news, the Florida federal judge Aileen Cannon dismissed the case that Jack Smith had brought, special counsel Jack Smith, on the classified documents front. And she did it on separation of powers argument. And I bring this up because this gets to you in Congress and your role. But one bit of her opinion said, the Appointments Clause is a central constitutional restriction stemming from the separation of powers, and it gives to Congress a considered role in determining the propriety of vesting appointment power for inferior officers. The special counsel's position effectively usurps that important legislative authority, end quote. And I would add, by the way, gives it to the AG. And she points out that he could have tapped somebody who went through that regular appointment process and got confirmed, or he could have used one of the 93 attorneys, U.S. attorneys that had already done it, and he chose not to. I would say, by the way, to kind of dodge his own political accountability of stepping up and making a decision on all of this. But what do you make of the opinion, and what do you think it means for the other case he's got going in the D.C. circuit? I know it's a different circuit.
So I think the opinion is right on. I think the opinion respects the Constitution of the United States. I think the opinion is consistent with what Justice Thomas outlined in his concurring opinion on the immunity case. So I think all that this is the right decision in my judgment. This issue was brought up when we had Merrick Garland in front of the committee. And of course, he says, I went outside of the U.S. attorneys or someone who'd been approved by Congress. I went outside of that to avoid the politics, is what he said, which is like, yeah, but if that were the case, you wouldn't pick Jack Smith. Forget it. You know this better than anyone because you were the one writing more about what took place back a dozen years ago when the Tea Party conservative groups were targeted by the IRS. And Jack Smith was involved in looking for ways to prosecute these people. But that's what he said. So I think it's a great decision. And I think all these cases are falling apart because they were all built on politics. They weren't built on the rule of law. They weren't built on enforcing the rule of law in the Constitution. They were lawfare at its worst. And it's why the Fonnie Willis case has fallen apart. Remember, before Judge Cannon's decision, Jack Smith's team had to file with the court, hey, we altered the order of the documents we seized at Mar-a-Lago. You're not supposed to do that.
Nope.
But they had to admit that to the court. So you changed the order of the documents of President Trump. You had to tell the court that. So, yeah, I think that all these cases are falling apart.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a few. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel here with Chairman Jim Jordan. I like the optimism you express that in some ways what you're saying is that the system is working and that this is political and the courts are not there to deal with this. But there's also been enormous damage politically that has come from this, even if they're failing. Okay. And let me ask you this question, like, how do you walk that line? And I would have my own answer to this, but what do you say to people who go, well, okay, Republicans rail against lawfare all the time. Lawfare is something distinct. It's actually using lawsuits in courts. It's like, but to target your political opponents, how is that different from what Republicans are doing in the House in terms of oversight? You know, impeachment of Joe Biden. Now, I would argue you don't have the ability to jail anyone or put them in prison, and this is oversight. But for those Americans out there who sort of see this as equal, make the distinction for that.
Well, I would say just what you said. I agree 100% with what you said. We have a duty under the Constitution to provide oversight of the executive branch over all these agencies. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out they have been in many ways turned on the very people they're supposed to serve. We, the people, the taxpayers. So we have a duty to do that oversight, but we can't indict anyone. We can't prosecute anyone. We can only get the facts, and we get the facts in order to influence how we do the appropriations process and what legislative changes we may want to make that impact how these agencies operate. That is our duty. So we do this for a legislative purpose. The courts have been clear. That's why we do oversight, and to influence how we spend the taxpayer money. So that's why we do it. Now, sometimes just letting the world know what's going on in these agencies changes behavior.
Yeah.
Great example. There is no longer a disinformation governance board at the Department of Homeland Security because we made a big issue of this, and folks like you on the outside in the media said this is ridiculous. You can't have bureaucrats telling Americans what they can say, what they can't say. We no longer have the IRS making unannounced visits to American citizens' homes. Danny Warfel said, the commissioner said, we're doing this for the safety of our agents. Baloney, you're doing it because we caught you knocking on Matt Taibbi's door while we were had him as a witness at a hearing, for goodness sake. So sometimes just that changes behavior, and we're seeing that not just in those areas, but others as well.
The fact that this this judge has now dismissed his case. I know you've been looking into the special counsel's office. Does it change what you're doing in terms of investigative oversight sort of perspective, or are you still searching for answers there, regardless of what happens in this case?
Yeah, we're still doing our oversight on a host of things. This whole censorship regime, the censorship industrial complex, as people have called it, we're looking at that. We're looking at how some of these big government is working with big tech, big media to influence things. So we're still looking at all that information. And then, of course, in light of what happened on Saturday, I think a lot of our oversight over the next few weeks is going to be focused on the breakdown in what should have happened there and the security posture at the president's rally.
You and I have seen this evolve because you were immensely helpful. I wrote a book a while back I called The Intimidation Game, and you just mentioned it, the IRS, but we had this enormous debacle, this attack on the Republican Party and Republican Party activists in Wisconsin.
In the state, yeah,
crazy stuff. Now we've seen that evolve into the Department of Justice itself and state AGs abusing their power to go after political opponents. Given how fearful a lot of voters are about where this all ends, would it be beneficial for Republicans in this, what could well be the next administration, a Trump administration, to use this week to say, if we're elected, that ends?
Yeah, there's no place for politics to drive the Justice Department, for goodness sake. That is the scariest thing. And we're seeing it. It's frightening because we've said this many times. If they can go up to the president of the United States, they can think about what they can do to a regular citizen. So, yeah, it's a scary direction that the left has taken us. We pointed this out last week. Colangelo, the guy who was the chief prosecutor in the Bragg case, who had went from the AG of New York's office to the Justice Department, then up to Bragg's office. The individual, when he applied for the job at the AG's office in New York, his top two references were Tom Perez and Jeff Zients. Now think about that. Tom Perez, former chair of the Democrat National Committee, and Jeff Zients, the current chief of staff to President Biden, were his top references when he went to work for Letitia James, who was going after President Trump. Okay, but I know. In light of the history and everything, that's a real concern.
Your other oversight investigations, I want to touch on them real quick. So you've mentioned some of these. Some of these look like they're kind of coming to a conclusion. You just had another really great report on the 51 intel officials who interfered in the 2020 election. We now know that there was some planning involved in all of that, and the Biden campaign was also involved in some of that, and the Hunter Biden laptop disinformation that came out. You just mentioned the free speech and the censorship thing. We got a Supreme Court decision. It didn't really give us an answer we'd like, but they didn't shut the door. Would you agree with that? No,
it's been remanded back. You're exactly right. We'd have preferred a better decision, but I think in the end, we're going to win there too, because it was definitely government pressuring big tech to censor Americans.
You've got a Biden impeachment report coming up on the Biden family business. Is there going to be things in there that people haven't seen yet, or what should be the takeaways?
Yeah, I think there will be. We're putting it together. You got 3 committees, and so that takes some work to put it all together, but we're doing that. I mean, we do a lot of reports, but this will be a big one, highlighting the investigative work over this entire Congress and highlighting what Hunter Biden's business partner, Devin Archer, told us, that what they were selling, what they were marketing was access to the brand. And the brand was, of course, Joe Biden. I mean, this is not Republicans talking. This is Hunter Biden's business partner, Devin Archer, under oath telling us that. So it'll highlight all that. And then those actions that then Vice President Biden took that we think are pretty wrong. So we're in the process of putting that all together.
When people look at that, the Democratic argument is, well, you haven't found a smoking gun check, money that went, directly in some $1 million payoff to Joe Biden. Isn't maybe the argument more about influence in office, and how, from a legislative perspective, do you deal with that going forward? I mean, there's the impeachment question, but then there's also, how do you guard against that happening again in office?
Again, I go back to, you do this for a legislative purpose and for the appropriation purposes or core functions in the legislative branch of government. But I think when you expose and show what happened, that has a tendency to change behavior. We talked about this earlier. So let's hope that makes a difference. It's just that fundamental question is, Joe Biden was in charge of so much in foreign policy in the Obama administration. And while he had that portfolio of work, his family was taking all kinds of money from foreign entities, and you don't know what they were really providing, what service, what they were providing, other than what Devin Archer, his business partner, Hunter Biden's business partner, told us. That is a concern. And so best example is Ukraine and Burisma, this energy company, and the fact that Hunter Biden gets put on the board. He's not qualified to be on the board. He said so himself. While he's on the board, he gets asked by the top people at the company, at Burisma, to weigh in with D.C. to relieve the pressure they are under. 4 days later, his father, then vice president, goes to Ukraine and says, you're not getting loan guarantee money from the United States taxpayer unless you fire the guy who's applying the pressure. And he gets fired. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. And I think that's pretty compelling. It's why I was in favor of, moving into an impeachment inquiry phase of our oversight, which the full House voted on. And a majority said we should move into that phase. And we're still in that phase. Frankly, on some other issues, we think that helps us. We're in court right now over the Robert Hur special counsel audio tapes. And so, when you're in impeachment inquiry, you're entitled to the best evidence. And we think we're going to win that case.
Do you think you can expedite that to get it before the election?
We're trying. We went to court, 3 weeks ago? I think 3 weeks ago yesterday, if I remember right. 2 or 3 weeks ago. We hope so. Some argue there's no real privilege, even though they asserted it. If they did assert the privilege, we think they've waived it when they gave us the transcript.
Sure.
And when the Attorney General agreed to give us the report. So you've given us all that, but somehow we can't have the best evidence, even though we're in impeachment inquiry. We think that our case is strong and will prevail in court. But like you said, it takes time.
Do you think Joe Biden gets impeached by the House?
Our job is to put together the facts and then present the facts to the body, to the House. And that's what we're doing. And then it'll be a decision for our leadership and for the House of Representatives.
Yeah. We're going to take one more break. Hang tight.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. Again, Kim Strassel here with Jim Jordan, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. Let me just ask you a little bit about the future of the Republican Party. We were just talking about Ohio's native son, J.D. Vance, and you were talking about young, articulate, very smart, and all of that. He also, I think, has some different views on economic policy than I certainly have. I don't know about you. You are a co-founder of the Freedom Caucus. We're both like big free market kind of peoples. Yeah. And he has, I think, moved a little bit more toward a wing of the party, a populist wing of the party, more money for low-income families, and a big embrace of unionism and trade organizations, including, some statements. He's not a fan of right to work, big extension of a lot of spending programs like the child tax credit, maybe corporate taxes, or at least on those that supposedly aren't pro-American enough. What do you think about all that, and how does the party bridge this divide?
Well, I think what President Trump has done, and I agree with it, and I think Senator Vance agrees with this as well, is the Republican Party is now a populist party, but it's a populist party rooted in conservative principle. And that second part is important. I always thought we should have been a little more populist. My dad was a union worker for General Motors, Dayton, Ohio, and was a Democrat until Ronald Reagan came along. And like so many Democrats said, enough of this Jimmy Carter stuff, I'm voting for Reagan. And he's been a conservative Republican ever since, listened to Rush Limbaugh, and is going to vote for President Trump again. Him and my mom both. President Trump has done that, where he believes in the free market, but there's this populist element that I think is so important. And I think that's where the party always should have been. Populist party, but rooted in conservative principle. And we can't forget that, because pure populism is a
problem.
Yeah, it's a problem. And the founders understood that. Focused on working class families, middle class families, focused on families. I think all that is positive. And I would argue that position is why Ohio went from being the bellwether swing state to a state that President Trump won by 8.5 in 16, 8.5 points in 20. I think he's going to win it by more. And if he wins it by more, if he wins it by 10, Bernie Moreno is our next senator. And we don't have Sherrod Brown, who is not a part of a party that's populist and rooted in conservative principle. So that's how we got to look at this.
Okay, so you're talking about the binary choice here. Yeah. But is there a warning there about, look, I agree. Where I live, half my husband's friends and I, union workers, there's a difference between respect for the union cause and absolutely what they do. And is there a warning, though, about not following this populism so far down the path that we end up implementing policies that don't leave a good impression on people? Because you have to make the economy work in the end, right? And fundamentally, I believe one of the reasons there's a real chance Donald Trump is going to win, because people are looking back to his first term, and they remembered all the deregulation and the tax cuts and the low unemployment, everything that came from that. And it just strikes me that the conservative movement would be unwise to forget that's what kind of caused that economic prosperity.
I think that's well said. And if President Trump wins, the Trump-Vance ticket wins, and we get the Senate and we get the House, first thing you do is you focus on securing the border, you focus on renewing the tax cuts, and you focus on common sense energy policy where you get rid of all this ridiculous regulation that the left has put on the energy industry and so much of the rest of our economy. You do those three things, it's going to take off. It will. We're still the best economy going in spite of all the crazy stuff Joe Biden's doing. We're the best economy in the world. And this is with terrible inflation. Take your family out to dinner and see what it costs you. So you do those three things. When President Trump gets in, I think that's 1, 2, 3. Boom. Border, tax cuts, get rid of the regulatory burden they place, particularly in the energy sector. And our economy just starts earning and turning and burning like it was 4 years ago under President Trump.
Okay, last question. You just mentioned Bernie Moreno, possible senator. Do you guys keep the House?
I think so, yeah. I think we're going to pick up seats.
You do?
I was in Minneapolis on Saturday helping two of our colleagues. We're traveling all over the country helping. I know our leadership team is doing the same. I think we can pick up seats. It's hard to imagine we don't pick up seats when President Trump and Vice President Vance, the ticket is winning. So if they're winning, and if they win big like I think they're going to in Ohio, Bernie Moreno is going to beat Sherrod Brown. If they can win Pennsylvania by a few points, I think Dave McCormick is a great candidate. Great. I campaigned with him. I think he can win Pennsylvania. We got a good candidate here in Wisconsin on the Senate. We got a good candidate, Sheehy, out in Montana. So I think we're poised to do it. And you can feel the energy here at the convention because I think our voters, I think Republicans see it. I think independents are going to come our way. I mean, I feel really good about where we're headed.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan. And thank you to all the listeners tuning in to this episode of All Things with Kim Strassel, coming to you from Milwaukee and the Republican National Convention. If you like the podcast, please hit subscribe on your favorite outlet for podcasts.